Tea sugar, says secrets, and one fatal sip. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me where you're tuning in from. I love seeing this community grow. Your comments make every mystery even sweeter. Let's begin. If you ever want to see Nero Wolfe frown without moving a single muscle, walk into his office carrying a bakery box. That's what Miss Judith Rayner did on a Wednesday at 10:43 a.m., a time usually reserved for Wolfe's orchids in silence. She was tall, composed, and carrying a white pastry box with a gold ribbon. Fritz would have taken it personally. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when she crossed the threshold, the scent of sugar and almond paste trailing behind her like a deliberate insult to Wolfe's waistline. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, setting the box on the corner of his desk as if placing an offering before an idol. "I bring you a peace token, or perhaps a bribe." That got my attention. Wolfe didn't look up. He was examining the morning mail through half-closed lids, deciding which envelopes deserved the honor of his hands. "Pfui," he murmured finally. "If it is a bribe, it is poorly conceived. I'm bribed with logic, not calories." I watched Miss Rayner smile, a slow, calculating motion that hinted she wasn't the type to be disarmed by sarcasm. "It's not meant for you to eat, Mr. Wolfe," she said. "It's meant for you to consider." That did it. He lifted his head, which for Nero Wolfe is the equivalent of a handstand. "Explain," he said. The box, as it turned out, contained 6 marzipan fruits: pears, oranges, plums, the kind of thing that takes more effort than pleasure to make. But each had a small silver paper tag on the bottom, typed initials in fine courier script. JRDFSLAPMWNW. 6 people, I said. "One of them's you, Miss Rayner, and one's the boss here." Her gaze flicked to me, then back to Wolfe. "The initials are members of the Rayner Foundation's board, mine included. Yours, Mr. Wolfe, was added this morning." That got me halfway to the edge of my chair. Wolfe's eyebrows rose, which is his version of a gasp. "You are presuming my inclusion in some confectionery conspiracy." "I'm presuming," she said, "that someone wants you dead." Now that might sound like a line from a B-picture script, but Miss Rayner delivered it like a fact she'd rehearsed a dozen times. She explained that 2 days ago, a fellow board member, Douglas Frayne, collapsed at a luncheon after tasting a marzipan pear identical to these. The coroner called it a cardiac event, but a chemist friend of hers found traces of something else, aconitine, a poison elegant enough to impress even Wolfe, though I'd never suggest he test the recipe. She wanted him to investigate quietly, before the press or the police turned her foundation's charitable reputation into confetti, and before another marzipan found its mark. Wolfe drummed his fingers on the armrest, his eyes half closed. "You are aware, madam, that I do not leave this house. Not for luncheons, nor funerals, nor philanthropy." "I'm aware," she said evenly. "Which is why, whoever sent this—" She gestured at the box. "Knew you wouldn't have to leave to receive it." I caught the flicker in Wolfe's expression then. Something between irritation and intrigue. The kind of look that means his appetite for logic was waking up. He said, "You will leave the box. Mr. Goodwin will accompany you to your foundation this afternoon to acquire the relevant facts." "Of course," she said, standing. "You'll find the board divided, but you'll also find motive enough for all 6 names, including mine." She was halfway out the door before Wolfe added, "Miss Rayner, who sent that box to me?" She paused, one hand on the knob. "I don't know," she said, "but whoever did wants your name among the fruits." When the door closed, I gave Wolfe the look that means you just adopted a headache with high heels. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and said, "Archie, dispose of those abominations. Burn them, bury them, or send them to the Bureau of Poisonous Foods. But for heaven's sake, do not eat them." I said, What about lunch? He opened one eye. If Fritz serves marzipan, he said, I shall retire from humanity altogether. When Wolfe says he'll remain in his chair, he means it the way the Pope means he'll remain Catholic. By the time Miss Rayner's perfume had cleared the office, he'd already gone silent and motionless, sinking back into that chair like a man preparing to commune with logic itself. I, on the other hand, had a date with the city, specifically the Rayner Foundation headquarters on East 68th. Fritz gave me a look on my way out that said he'd already checked the marzipan box and burned it ceremoniously. When a man spends 30 years in Wolfe's kitchen, he learns to treat strange desserts like live grenades. The cab ride was short and warm enough to make me regret my winter coat. I used the time to dig through my notebook, which now had 6 tidy initials to start a roster. JR for Judith Rayner, my new favorite troublemaker, DF for the late Douglas Frayne, who'd keeled over from the deadly dessert, SL, AP, and MW. Still blank faces to fill in, and finally, NW, which someone had apparently decided stood for Nero Wolfe, not a member, but a mark. The Rayner Foundation occupied a townhouse that had been scrubbed of personality and replaced with the moral equivalent of beige wallpaper. Money had been here, long ago, but it had the air of a place where every carpet stain came with a memo. The receptionist had an expression that said she'd been warned to expect me and didn't like it. "Mr. Goodwin?" she asked. "That's right," I said, flashing my smile, the one that gets cops to talk and doormen to forget. They saw me. "Miss Rayner's expecting me." The smile didn't work. She just pressed a button on her phone and said, "He's here." Miss Rayner appeared a minute later, her composure freshly ironed. Whatever emotion she'd shown in Wolfe's office was gone now. The woman beside me was pure efficiency. "I'm glad you came," she said. "We've tried to keep this quiet, but the staff has begun whispering. The police took statements, but they accepted the heart failure story. I didn't." We moved through a hall lined with photographs, awards ceremonies, hospital wings, scholarship dinners. Wolfe would have called it sentimental camouflage. "Tell me about Frayne," I said. "The late gourmet." She hesitated only a moment. Douglas was the board's treasurer, careful, skeptical, always pressing for audits. He was convinced someone was manipulating our overseas charity accounts. Small transfers, nothing glaring but suspicious patterns. "And he told you this?" "2 days before he died." That explained why Wolfe's name had suddenly appeared in confectionery form. Someone had wanted to divert suspicion, make it look like the box was part of a broader threat, not a targeted one. I made notes while she led me into a conference room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and tension. Inside were 3 people, all pretending not to be startled by my entrance. "This is Archie Goodwin," Rayner announced. "He represents Nero Wolfe." That name did the trick. One of them, a lean fellow with grey temples and the permanent squint of a lawyer, straightened. "You brought Wolfe into this? God help us." "That's Saul Liddell," she said, "our legal counsel." The woman beside him, severe in a navy suit, introduced herself without prompting. "Amelia Park, communications director." Her handshake was firm and humorless. The last man, round-faced with eyes that had seen too much whiskey and not enough sleep, muttered, "Milton Ward, logistics." I made a mental note. If I ever form a foundation, I'll skip logistics. Too many ways to bury things. "Let's keep this simple," I said. "I'm here because someone decided Mr. Wolfe's name belonged on a dessert plate beside the late Mr. Frayne's. Miss Rayner believes Frayne didn't die naturally. Anyone here disagree?" Silence. A shuffle of papers. Then Liddell said, "If you're suggesting one of us poisoned him, you're wasting your time. We've all been through the ringer already." "I'm not suggesting anything," I said, "yet. I'd just like to start with the people closest to the money, the mission, and the marzipan." That earned a faint twitch from Miss Park. Liddell's mouth tightened. Ward reached for a cigarette he couldn't light indoors. The air grew thick enough to slice. Rayner broke it. "Mr. Goodwin, you should see Douglas's office. I've kept it sealed since his death." We left the boardroom and crossed a corridor to a small office with a brass nameplate. Douglas Frayne, Treasurer. Inside, the air was still. Too still, like the room was holding its breath. The desk was neat, except for a stack of ledgers, a metal letter opener shaped like a dagger, and a half-burned candle on the windowsill. The candle was odd, unnecessary for light, too ornamental for mood. Rayner frowned. "That wasn't here when I left last night." That made two of us frowning. I stepped closer. The wax was fresh, still soft near the wick. Someone had been here. I jotted the time and said, "Do you have keys?" "Only I do," she said, "and our office manager. But she's on leave." "Then either the ghosts are unionized or someone made a copy." I picked up the letter opener and examined the edge. Clean, no residue, but the candle had a faint indentation at its base, something pressed in while the wax was soft. I pulled a handkerchief from my pocket and carefully rolled it, revealing a metallic sliver half embedded in the wax. A tag. Silver paper, the same size as the ones from the marzipan fruits. The initials on it were AP. Rayner's hand flew to her mouth. "Amelia Park." "Yeah," I said softly. "Looks like our communications director left a message." I pocketed the tag and closed the door behind us. "You'll keep this room locked until Wolfe says otherwise. And don't breathe a word about this to anyone. Not yet." On the cab ride back, I replayed the meeting in my head. Each of them had watched me differently. Liddell with contempt, Ward with anxiety, Park with calculation. Rayner had watched all three of them, which meant she trusted none. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair with a book open, pretending not to wait for me. I dropped my hat and said, "We've got suspects with motives, finances that smell like week-old oysters, and a silver tag with Miss Park's initials found in the dead man's office." He didn't look up. "A tag. Describe it." I did. "Excellent," he said. "The confectioner's mark becomes the murderer's emblem. Admirable symmetry. You admire everything except the possibility that someone's trying to kill you." He closed the book. "Bah. If they wished me dead, they would have sent a more imaginative toxin. Tell Miss Rayner to expect inquiries tomorrow. Tonight I require information." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Saul Panzer is to locate the manufacturer of those marzipan fruits. Have him trace every purchase within the past month." I nodded, though I knew that tone meant the game had already begun. Wolfe's gaze drifted to the fireplace, his lips tightening slightly. "Someone," he said, "has chosen to sweeten death with artifice. That suggests vanity, and vanity, Archie, is the crack through which logic seeps." I grinned. "You're saying you've got a theory?" "Not yet," he murmured, "but I have an appetite." And that, from Nero Wolfe, was as close to a declaration of war as you could get without leaving your chair. That night, the brownstone was quieter than usual. The orchids upstairs had Wolfe's full attention, and the rest of the house felt like it was holding its breath. I'd sent Saul Panzer his assignment before dinner, trace the marzipan, find the source, report by morning, and now I was at my desk, reviewing my notes under the soft hum of the office lamp. Wolfe came in at 9 sharp, freshly fortified by beer and beef. He lowered himself into the red leather chair with the same gravity as a man descending into a throne, pulled a cigar from the humidor, and said without preamble, "Your report, Archie." I gave it to him cleanly, from Judith Rayner's nervous precision to Amelia Park's frozen handshake. When I got to the candle and the silver tag, his eyes lifted from half-closed to three-quarters open. For Wolfe, that's a standing ovation. He steepled his fingers. "You are certain the wax was recent?" fresh enough to smudge. Whoever left that tag did it after Frayn's death. Maybe last night, maybe this morning. He blew a slow plume of smoke. Then Miss Park, or someone wishing to implicate her, has an inconvenient habit of revisiting crime scenes. Tell me about her manner. Controlled, precise, the kind who keeps her sentences ironed, but she flinched when I mentioned the marzipan. Flinched, Wolfe repeated, tasting the word like a new spice. A sign of guilt, fear, or indigestion. We shall determine which. He picked up the phone and barked for Fritz to bring coffee. Then he sat back and stared at nothing in particular. I've seen that look before. It's what comes right before he rearranges the entire world in his head until the pieces fit. At 10, Saul called. I took the receiver. Got something? He chuckled. You owe me a slice of Fritz's cheesecake. The marzipan was made by a specialty shop called Maison de Fleur on Lexington. They sell in small batches, custom orders only. Yesterday morning, someone bought 2 boxes of identical marzipan fruit. Paid cash. The order name on the slip was RF. RF, I repeated. Not one of our board initials. Nope, but the clerk said the buyer was a woman, late 30s, brunette, expensive taste, nervous hands. Sound familiar? Could be Rayner, I said. Or Park. Or someone who borrowed lipstick from either. I'll check the shop's back records tonight, Saul said. See if RF or RF shows up anywhere else. When I hung up, Wolfe was watching me as if he'd been listening through osmosis. I relayed the news. RF, he murmured. Rayner Foundation. A clever misdirection or a declaration. Either way, the confectioner is our first honest witness. You will visit in the morning. He reached for his beer and added, And Archie, when you do, observe everything. A liar often leaves fingerprints in words. By the time I turned in for the night, the house was silent again, except for the faint creak of the floorboards above. Wolfe's deliberate pacing before bed, which meant he was still stirring thoughts in the pot. Morning brought clear skies and bad coffee. Fritz was out early for market errands, so I settled for my own brew, which even Wolfe wouldn't touch. By 9, I was on Lexington Avenue, staring at Maison de Fleur, a tiny confectionery with gold lettering and enough pastel decor to give a dentist night terrors. The shop smelled like sugar, almonds, and secrets. Behind the counter was a middle-aged woman with hair so white it looked powdered. She wore an apron embroidered with the shop's logo and a smile that had survived too many customer complaints. Good morning, I said. I'm interested in your marzipan fruit. The fancy kind, like these. I slid one of the tags from my pocket and placed it on the counter. Her smile froze. Ah, you're with the police? Something like that, I said. Private inquiry. The person who bought 2 boxes yesterday morning, name on the slip was RF. You remember her? Her fingers fluttered. Of course. Tall, very elegant, with a grey coat. She was particular about the paper. Silver tags, she insisted. We do not usually use them, but she brought her own. She brought the tags herself? Oui. Already cut, already printed. Very small letters, but neat. She told me each piece was a gift, a token for colleagues. She seemed anxious. Paid cash. Did she leave anything behind? A receipt, perhaps? The woman hesitated, then reached under the counter and produced a carbon copy slip with looping handwriting. The order name, RF, was written in blue ink, but the pen had hesitated over the first letter, like the writer wasn't sure which initial to use. Mind if I borrow this? Yes, if it helps. I left her with a thank you and stepped outside, breathing in the cold air to clear the sugar out of my lungs. The hesitation on that first letter wasn't random. It could have started as a J before becoming an R. Judith Rayner, maybe, or someone wanting it to look that way. I called Wolfe from the nearest payphone. The buyer might have been Rayner herself, or someone pretending. The tags were pre-made. She brought them with her. Wolfe's voice came back crisp as linen. Pre-made implies forethought. That narrows our field to the intelligent, which unfortunately excludes few. What about the handwriting? Bring it to me. Bring also your impressions of the confectioner. Every witness is a mirror of the liar they've served. When I got back to the brownstone, he was mid-argument with Fritz about the proper method for preparing trout. He waved me into silence, took the receipt, and studied it under his magnifying glass. The hesitation here, he said, tapping the top of the R, is indeed the ghost of another letter. J, perhaps, or A. Miss Rayner or Miss Park. Either could have purchased the box. The question is not who bought it, but why 2 boxes? Insurance, I suggested. If one didn't reach the right stomach, the other might. He gave a grunt that meant approval. Cynical but credible. The buyer wanted 1 box to disappear publicly and 1 privately. Miss Rayner received hers. The other found its way to Mr. Frayne. That makes the confection both a message and a weapon. Before I could answer, the phone rang again. Wolfe gestured for me to take it. It was Saul. Archie, he said. I went back through Maison de Fleur's old orders. Guess what? 3 weeks ago, a standing order was placed under the same initials, RF, for delivery to a P.O. box registered to a Douglas Frayne. I stiffened. The victim himself? Yeah. Looks like he'd been getting marzipan before he died. When I hung up, Wolfe's eyes were gleaming. So, he murmured, our victim may have been receiving his own death in installments. Delicious irony. He rose slightly, rare enough to mark significance. Archie, summon Miss Rayner for tomorrow morning, and call Saul. He will find where those earlier boxes went after delivery. I suspect our killer is not finished with confectionery symbolism. He sank back into his chair, fingers pressed together. A sweet death, Archie, he said softly. But beneath the sugar, I smell corruption, and that, my dear fellow, is always bitter. The following morning began with a kind of heavy stillness that told me Wolfe was already awake, thinking. When he's deep in a case, even the orchids know better than to bloom too loudly. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when Fritz informed me Miss Rayner had arrived, precisely on time. Wolfe never appreciates punctuality in guests. It implies they expect efficiency from him, but he allowed her into the office anyway. She entered, looking composed but tight around the eyes. Her gloves were still in her hand, twisting slightly. Mr. Wolfe, she said, you asked to see me again so soon. Has something developed? Everything develops, he said. Entropy assures it. He gestured to the red leather chair facing his desk. Sit. We will discuss your late colleague's indulgence in marzipan and the curious matter of duplicated boxes. I took my usual perch and opened my notebook. She sat, her posture straight but strained. Wolfe's gaze didn't move from her face. Miss Rayner, how well did you know Mr. Frayne? Her answer came carefully measured. Professionally, for 6 years. Personally, little. He was efficient, demanding, and sometimes cruel in his assessments, but he cared about the Foundation's integrity. Enough to suspect wrongdoing? Her head lifted sharply. Yes, he approached me about irregularities in our overseas funds. Small transfers that didn't match the official. Ledgers. He believed someone was skimming through our partner programs in Geneva. And you? Wolfe asked. I believed him, she said, but he wouldn't show me the documents until he'd confirmed them himself. Did he? She hesitated. He told me he had proof. He said he'd be bringing it to the next board meeting. Wolfe leaned back, fingers pressed together like the apex of a roof. And instead he died. She nodded once. 2 days before. Convenient timing, I added. Her eyes met mine. You think I killed him? Wolfe interrupted before I could reply. I think nothing yet, but I am intrigued by your composure. Guilt and virtue both produce it, though for opposite reasons. That didn't rattle her as much as I expected. She took a breath, straightened her shoulders. I didn't send you that box, Mr. Wolfe. I wanted you to help. Someone is trying to tie me to Frayne's death, and now to you. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Then tell me this. Have you ever purchased anything from Maison de Fleur? Her confusion looked genuine. The confectioner? No, I don't even eat sweets. I watched Wolfe's face for any hint of reaction. Nothing. But I've worked with him long enough to know that silence means he's filing something important into the drawers of that oversized brain. He said finally, then someone borrowed your initial. And your foundations. She nodded slowly, which narrows it to someone with access to both. One of the board. Or someone outside the board who knows too much, I said. That earned me a sharp glance from Wolfe, which meant I'd skipped ahead of his planned progression. He hates that. He turned back to her. Miss Rayner, you will provide me with full details of every board member, backgrounds, connections, and financial ties, particularly abroad. Mr. Goodwin will collect the files this afternoon. She stood, grateful for the order. Of course, I'll have them ready by 2. When she left, the air settled again. Wolfe sighed like a man who'd been forced to speak too much before breakfast. Archie, Saul's diligence will soon illuminate the distribution of our deadly confectionery. But the deeper rot lies in the Foundation's finances. Someone used Frayne's discovery as pretext for murder. Which means the motive isn't dessert, I said. Precisely. The sweets are camouflage. An aesthetic indulgence, one that speaks of vanity and intellect. Our culprit appreciates irony. That made sense. You don't lace marzipan with aconitine unless you want to make death look delicate. At 2 o'clock, I picked up the files from Miss Rayner's office. She handed me a thick manila envelope and warned, "Be careful. I think someone's been going through my desk." "Anything missing?" I asked. "A set of keys," she said, "for the storage cabinet in Frayne's office." That hit me harder than I let on. I thanked her and got out fast before anyone could notice her talking to Wolfe's man. Back at the brownstone, I laid the envelope on Wolfe's desk. He opened it delicately, as if it might contain explosives. Inside were 5 profiles. Amelia Park, the communications director. Saul Liddell, the lawyer. Milton Ward, logistics. Judith Rayner herself. And one more. Harvey Durrant, an international liaison, listed as consultant. Wolfe's brows rose a fraction. "Durrant, he was not present at your meeting yesterday." "Nope. Rayner said he's been in Europe for months." Wolfe grunted. "Too convenient. The man abroad when the money wanders abroad. Find him." "Sure, I'll call Saul. He can run down Durrant's travel records." Wolfe nodded absently, scanning Durrant's profile. "Note that he handles the Geneva partnerships. If Frayne discovered irregularities, they likely trace through Durrant's channels." Just then, the phone rang again. This time it was Saul, his tone tight. "Archie, you'll want to hear this. Remember those earlier marzipan shipments sent to Frayne's P.O. box? The shipping address was changed a week before his death, to the Rayner Foundation office." "Which department?" I asked. "None specified. Just the building's address. Someone wanted those boxes to land where everyone could access them." When I relayed that to Wolfe, he shut his eyes, pressing thumb and forefinger against his temple. Elegant, the poison placed within reach of all, ensuring suspicion for each. The hand unseen. He opened his eyes again, glinting sharp now. "Archie, you will invite Miss Park here tomorrow morning at 10. Tell her I wish to discuss the Foundation's communications policy regarding charitable transparency. She will come out of vanity, if not curiosity. And when she does, we will see how she reacts to the ghost of her initials." He smiled faintly, which on Wolfe is a rare and usually unpleasant thing. I intend to dislodge her mask without touching it. That night I could tell he was still turning the case over in his head. He ate little, which for Wolfe is a clear sign of agitation. When I asked if he thought Park was guilty, he merely said, "The intelligent woman always complicates deduction, Archie. She decorates deceit with reason." I didn't sleep much. At one point, I heard him pacing the hall outside his bedroom, a quiet, rhythmic shuffle that meant he was working through the architecture of motive. By dawn, I'd made up my mind to tail Park after our morning meeting, just in case Wolfe's verbal fencing didn't draw enough blood. At 10 sharp the next day, Amelia Park arrived. Her perfume entered before she did, sharp and deliberate. Wolfe had arranged his office like a stage, chair angled toward the light, coffee prepared but untouched, the air warm and still. She sat opposite him, eyes wary but intrigued. "You wanted to discuss our communication policies, Mr. Wolfe?" He nodded once. "Indeed. But first, I must commend your composure under strain." That got her. "Strain," she repeated. "Of course, the death of a colleague, the inquiries, the misunderstandings." His tone was mild, almost sympathetic. "Tell me, Miss Park, do you find guilt burdensome or invigorating?" She stiffened. "If this is meant to be an interrogation—" "It is meant," Wolfe interrupted, "to be an observation. You're either the cleverest of the innocent or the most meticulous of the guilty." Her eyes flashed, then cooled. "If you have an accusation, Mr. Wolfe, make it." He smiled faintly. "Not yet. I prefer that you make it for me." She rose abruptly. "Then you'll be waiting a long time." "Perhaps," he said. "But time, Miss Park, is the one commodity I possess in excess. A pity the same cannot be said for your late colleague." She froze, the smallest flicker in her jaw betraying the hit. Then she turned and walked out without another word. When the door closed, Wolfe looked at me. "Archie, follow her." I grabbed my hat. "Any particular reason?" "Yes," he said, eyes half-lidded again. "Because she blinked." Archie Goodwin's voice carries the story forward here, as the tension between Wolfe's deliberate chess game and Park's nervous deflections starts to coil tighter. The instant Wolfe gave the order, I was out the door. Amelia Park was already halfway down the steps, moving fast enough to ruin her composure, but not her sense of direction. She turned east, cutting toward Madison, her heels tapping like a typewriter keying its own confession. I followed from a safe distance, ducking behind a lamp-post when she glanced over her shoulder. She wasn't going home or to the foundation. She was heading somewhere she didn't want connected to either. She stopped at a small cafe called the Juniper Room, a discreet little spot where conversations disappear faster than coffee. I waited across the street until she took a corner table, then slipped inside, bought a cup I didn't need, and found a seat behind her reflection in the window. 5 minutes later, a man entered, a trim, dark-haired fellow in a grey suit, mid-40s, cautious in every step. He spotted her and went straight to the table. From where I sat, I couldn't hear much over the clatter of dishes, but I saw hands move, papers slide across the table, and Park's jaw tighten. She said something sharp. He shook his head, kept his voice low. The conversation wasn't friendly. He glanced toward the window once, a quick nervous scan that brushed past me, and I recognized him from one of Rayna's files, Harvey Durrant, the overseas consultant supposedly in Europe. So much for passports and alibis. When Park stood, she did it too quickly. The papers vanished into a handbag, and she left through a side exit. Durrant lingered just long enough to finish his coffee, then left the opposite way. That was fine. I followed Park. She took a cab uptown. I took another, kept 2 cars behind. She stopped at a brownstone on 82nd, went inside without ringing. The building had that polished, quiet look of money owned by people who didn't have to talk about it. I jotted the address and headed back to the office. Wolfe listened to my report without interruption, eyes closed, hands resting like a statue's. When I finished, he said, So, Miss Park meets secretly with a man who is both geographically misrepresented and financially entangled. Yep, Durrant's very much alive and domestic. Indeed, that simplifies matters. The connection between them is the pivot of this affair. He reached for a beer, opened it without ceremony. She lies to protect him, or they both lie to protect themselves. Either way, deceit has found its partner. He drank thoughtfully. The handbag, did you note its capacity? Average, I said. Big enough for a few papers, not for a ledger. Then the documents she carried were selective. Possibly those Mr. Frayne intended to reveal. A woman careful enough to poison delicacies is careful enough to choose which facts survive. Meaning Park had the proof Frayne died for? Or she believes she does, he said. We must persuade her to share it. How? She's already halfway to burning it. He smiled faintly. Not burning, concealing. Guilt conceals, fear destroys. We shall test which moves her. At 5 o'clock, Saul called again. Archie, found something interesting. Durrant withdrew $15,000 from a Geneva account last month. Funds labeled as consulting expenses. Only problem, the account belongs to the foundation, not him. That ties him tight enough to choke, I said. Yeah, but here's the kicker. Amelia Park's name shows up on 2 wire confirmations. She authorized them. I thanked him, hung up, and turned to Wolfe. So Our Lady of Communications has been doing some creative bookkeeping. He nodded slowly. And Mr. Frayne, devoted auditor, must have found the pattern, hence the marzipan. He rang for Fritz, told him to prepare dinner early, which meant his mind was already arranging the next move. When the plates arrived, roast duck, asparagus, and an herbed souffle he barely touched. He was still talking. We will not accuse them yet. We will invite them to incriminate one another. Meaning another performance in the office? I asked. He lifted an eyebrow. Naturally. Miss Rayner, Miss Park, Mr. Liddell, and Mr. Ward. All summoned tomorrow evening. And Durrant, if you can fetch him from whatever borough he inhabits. Tell him the invitation is urgent, and that refusal would be unwise. I grinned. The old gathering trick. You think they'll all show? They will, he said. Fear and curiosity are twin leashes. They always lead the guilty to the same room. That night I couldn't shake the picture of Park's face at the cafe. Tense, calculating, but scared beneath it. Maybe she hadn't killed Frayne herself, but she knew who had. And tomorrow, Wolfe intended to make her say it aloud. The next day passed in a slow coil of anticipation. I spent the morning tracking Durrant. A few calls through Saul's channels confirmed he was staying under the name Harvey Dunn at the St. Regis. I called his room. Mr. Dunn, I said cheerfully. Archie Goodwin, assistant to Nero Wolfe. Mr. Wolfe requests your presence this evening at 7 o'clock, concerning the Rayner Foundation. There was silence on the line, then a low, cautious voice. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. Bring your conscience and maybe a clean handkerchief. You'll need one of the two. He hung up. But at 7, he'd come. They always did. By 6:30, the office was staged like a courtroom. Chairs arranged, coffee prepared, Wolfe in place behind his desk, motionless except for the faint tapping of his forefinger. Fritz ushered in the guests one by one. Rayner looked pale but composed. Liddell came stiff-backed and irritable, Ward nervous enough to chew his tie. Park arrived last, until the door opened once more and Durrant walked in, hat in hand, eyes darting like a man walking into his own verdict. The door shut. The air thickened. Wolfe opened his eyes fully for the first time that day. Ladies and gentlemen, he said calmly, I thank you for coming. We are gathered not to discuss philanthropy, but corruption, and the confection that masked it. I intend to identify the hand that prepared both. Park's lips parted, but Wolfe raised a hand. No interruptions, if you please. Mr. Goodwin will provide a summary. I did, short, sharp, and deliberate. Frayne's suspicions, the poisoned marzipan, the fraudulent transfers. Every eye followed my words until the silence afterward felt like pressure. Wolfe looked at Durrant. You, sir, were abroad, or so the records claim. Yet you met Miss Park yesterday. Durrant started to protest, but Park's hand twitched, a small, involuntary movement Wolfe caught instantly. Ah, he murmured. The symphony of guilt. One instrument flinches, and the entire orchestra falters. He leaned forward slightly. Miss Park, you authorized those transfers. Mr. Durrant executed them. Mr. Frayne discovered them. The marzipan was your joint reply. Park's voice broke sharp. That's not true. It is, Wolfe said, soft but inexorable. You mixed the poison, not for profit, but to silence exposure, and when you delivered the second box to Miss Rayner's office, you added a final signature, your own initials hidden in wax. Her face drained. Durrant shifted, muttered, She told me it was only to scare him. Wolfe's eyes glinted. And yet the heart stops, and the foundation remains quiet, efficient. Silence hung, deep and complete. Then Park whispered, He wasn't supposed to die. Rayner gasped. Liddell swore under his breath. Wolfe closed his eyes. But he did. Intent and consequence rarely negotiate, Miss Park. He rang the bell for Fritz. Archie, call Inspector Kramer and tell him to bring a box for evidence. Something sweet. I did, while Wolfe leaned back again, serene as a man digesting both meal and mystery. When they were gone, he sighed. A pity. I had begun to respect her sense of aesthetics. Poison and aesthetics don't mix, I said. He gave me a weary look. Everything mixes, Archie. Only proportion decides whether it nourishes or kills. He reached for the last untouched beer and added quietly, and that, in the end, is true of people as well. The sirens had barely faded when Wolfe ordered the windows shut. He couldn't stand the smell of the city mixed with moral decay. Kramer and his boys had taken Park and Durrant downtown, leaving the brownstone to its usual silence. The evidence box sat on the corner of Wolfe's desk like an uninvited guest. The half-burned candle, the silver tag, the empty marzipan wrapper that had started it all. I was standing by the Globe bar, pouring myself a stiff one, when Wolfe said, Archie, sit down. We are not finished. That tone meant he was winding the spring back for another round. I took my seat. Finished. We've got confessions. Kramer's happy, and the Foundation will be chewing on its public statement for months. What's left? He glanced at the evidence box. The truth, Archie. It seldom aligns with confession. I leaned back, letting him spool out his logic. He stared at the box a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. Miss Park's words were desperate, but not dishonest. She said he wasn't supposed to die. Her guilt was moral, not malicious. You mean she didn't poison Frayne on purpose? That's a hell of a distinction to make after a aconitine hits the bloodstream. Indeed, Wolfe said, but it was not she who chose the dosage. That requires knowledge, precision, neither of which Miss Park demonstrated. She is capable of deceit, yes, but not science. The aconitine was measured, not improvised. I frowned. So you're saying Durrant measured it? No. He shut his eyes. Durrant is greedy, not careful. He used her ambition as his tool, but someone used them both. I missed it because I was distracted by elegance. Elegant poison, elegant motive, fits your theme, I said. He ignored that. There remains one fact unexamined, the arrival of the marzipan at my door. Why me? Because whoever sent it wanted you involved, I said, to make it look big, respectable, or unsolvable. Precisely. Yet the person who did so could not have expected to remain safe if I succeeded. That indicates arrogance or control. He opened his eyes again, sharp as glass. Who benefits, Archie, from having both the guilty exposed and the evidence destroyed by exposure? I thought about it. Rayner, I said slowly. She's the only one left standing. The Foundation clears its name. Frayne's suspicions die with the scandal, and she comes out as the noble reformer who called in the great Nero Wolfe. His lips twitched, not quite a smile. Good. You're learning. I stared at him. You think she played all of them? She orchestrated the chaos, yes. Miss Rayner is no fool. She brought the marzipan herself, introduced the threat to me, and ensured I would trace it through the appropriate suspects. She merely neglected to mention that she arranged the initial purchase. Hold it. The confectioner said the buyer's hand hesitated on the R. Maybe it started as a J. You're saying it was her hand. Yes. She staged uncertainty to plant doubt. Clever, but careless. She did not count on my memory of her perfume, which lingered faintly on the box, nor on the inconsistency in her story about the Foundation keys. I remembered her words. I think someone's been going through my desk. At the time, it had sounded like fear. Now it smelled like preparation. So she planned it, I said. She knew Frayne was onto the transfers. Fed Park just enough fear to push her, used Durrant's greed to fund her own clean-up. And when it all started to unravel, she brought it here, hoping you'd dig up enough mud to bury everyone else but her. Exactly, Wolfe said softly. The perfect arrangement, the guilty punished, the evidence conveniently destroyed by police procedure, and her hands washed in moral necessity. I whistled low. And you let her walk out free this afternoon. For now, he said. Justice must be invited before it can be served. I've merely set the table. He reached for the phone, dialed slowly, and asked for Inspector Kramer. When the growl on the other end answered, Wolfe's voice was smooth as butter. Inspector, you will find it useful to compare Miss Rayner's fingerprints against the silver tag and the candle wax. Yes, I know she brought them here, but the sequence of prints will tell you who placed them first. Precisely. I await your gratitude. He hung up and leaned back. By midnight, Kramer will have his revelation. You may tell him tomorrow that I accept no payment from murderers who disguise their ethics as charity. I watched him in silence. For a man who detests physical movement, he could destroy reputations from a seated position better than most armies. An hour later, the phone rang again. Fritz answered, then handed it to me with a worried look. It was Kramer. Goodwin, he said, tell your boss his hunch paid off. The prints match. Rayner's are underneath Park's. She handled the tag before it was ever attached, and we found trace wax on her gloves. She's been taken in. When I relayed that, Wolfe only nodded. Predictable. The symmetry pleases me. He poured himself a final glass of beer and stared into it like it contained philosophy. Miss Rayner sought to cleanse corruption by committing a greater one, in that she was merely human. I said, You almost sound sorry for her. Not sorry, he murmured. Disappointed. Intelligence without morality is an empty vessel, and she might have done fine work had she not mistaken cunning for virtue. He raised the glass, took a slow sip, and set it down. Archie, remind Fritz that I shall require lamb for dinner tomorrow. Something honest and uncomplicated. I grinned. I'll tell him, though after today, he might spike it with marzipan just to keep things interesting. Wolfe gave a small, weary "Pwee." Then he closed his eyes, his face easing back into that mask of composure that meant the case, in his mind, was over. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual noise, oblivious to the quiet justice that had unfolded in one fat man's office. I shut the lights, left him to his thoughts, and headed upstairs. As I passed the kitchen, Fritz was sealing the evening's leftovers with the precision of a surgeon. The scent of almonds drifted faintly from the pantry. I hesitated, sniffed once, and said, If that's marzipan, Fritz, Toss it. I've had enough sweetness for a lifetime." He smiled. "Of course, Mr. Goodwin." Upstairs, the night settled around the brownstone again, orderly and silent, as if the world outside had never intruded. Wolfe would read until midnight, drink his beer, and file the case away in the mental drawers, marked solved but unsatisfying. And me? I couldn't help wondering whether Judith Rayner, sitting somewhere in a holding cell, still thought she'd been clever. Because if there's one thing I've learned working for Nero Wolfe, it's that no one outsmarts the man who never stands up, especially not someone who thought she could sweeten death and call it virtue. The next morning started like every other at the brownstone, quiet, deliberate, and heavy with the scent of orchids and coffee. Fritz moved about the kitchen in silence, and Wolfe was in the plant rooms upstairs, lecturing Theodore about humidity like civilization depended on it. For my part, I was at my desk, trying to pretend the case was truly over. But it wasn't. Not really. Wolfe always says closure is for the unimaginative, and sure enough, by the time he came down for beer at 11, his expression told me his mind hadn't stopped chewing. He sat, sighed, and said, "Archie, the morning papers, if you please." I handed him the Gazette. The headline took half the front page. "Charity Director Charged in Poisoning Plot." There was a photo of Judith Rayner being led out of the precinct, chin high, eyes steady, every inch the martyr she wanted to be. Wolfe read the article twice, slow and silent, then folded it with surgical precision. "She does not deny it," he said finally. "Only claims necessity. I thought she might." "She's calling it moral cleansing," I said. "The foundation had rot, so she trimmed the branches. Pity she forgot people aren't trees." He grunted, unimpressed. "Bah, the self-righteous criminal is the dullest variety. They believe sin can be refined by intellect." I leaned back. "Kramer called earlier. He said the DA thinks the jury will eat it up. Idealism gone too far. Makes for a fine headline." Wolfe frowned as if the words themselves offended him. "It trivializes intent. A jury will look at her face and see conviction instead of calculation. She will be punished for her audacity, not her crime." "Justice with frosting," I said. "The public likes a sweet story." He shot me a look for the pun, then gestured toward the window. "Human appetite, Archie. It dictates more than diet." We spent the next hour in silence, him dissecting the philosophical anatomy of guilt, me pretending to take notes but mostly thinking about Rayner. There was something about her that didn't fit neatly in Wolfe's taxonomy of human folly. She wasn't just corrupt. She'd believed in her cause, maybe too much. The poison had been her punctuation mark. At noon, the phone rang. Fritz answered, then handed it to me. "It's Inspector Kramer." Kramer's voice came through tight as wire. "Goodwin, tell your boss we found something else in Rayner's office. Hidden drawer in her desk. Ledger pages. Frayn's handwriting. He documented every transfer, every falsified receipt. She didn't destroy it after all." I covered the receiver. "You hear that, Wolfe? She kept the evidence." He looked up sharply. "Deliberately?" I asked Kramer, who said, "Seems so. They were sealed in an envelope marked 'Deliver to N.W.' in case of my arrest." "Any idea who that is?" Wolfe's eyes gleamed. "Indeed. Tell the district attorney those pages belong to the conscience she claimed to serve." They complete the circle. After hanging up, I said, "So she meant you. She wanted you to have the proof." "Yes," Wolfe said quietly. "And with it, vindication of her motives. A final manipulation. She knew I would despise the corruption she pretended to purge and that I might, posthumously, justify her act as necessity, a last bid for absolution through my name." "Then she still wins a little," I said. He shook his head. "No. Her gesture only confirms her vanity. The ledger is confession disguised as tribute. She wished to be understood, not forgiven." He poured a second glass of beer and stared at the foam as if it were the moral residue of humanity. Archie, the tragedy is not her guilt, but her intelligence. She understood the mechanics of deception perfectly, but not the essence of virtue. Knowledge without wisdom, it is the modern ailment. Seems like business as usual, I said, except this time it came gift-wrapped in almond paste. That earned a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth. Perhaps, he murmured, but I prefer my sweetness earned. The clock ticked quietly. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, ordinary life resuming where death had tried to make an impression. Wolfe set his glass down, signaling the end. "Archie, we shall close the ledger," he said, literally and figuratively. "File the case under the sweet death conspiracy. I find I've lost my appetite for dessert." I nodded, wrote the title neatly at the top of the page, and closed my notebook. As I rose, Fritz appeared with the lunch tray, cold salmon, brown bread, and a sprig of dill. Wolfe sniffed approvingly, his equilibrium restored. He'd think later about orchids and order and the folly of human ambition. I'd think about Judith Rayner and how justice sometimes looked a lot like mercy with better timing. By the time the dishes were cleared, the brownstone was back in balance. Quiet, composed, untouched. The world might tremble outside, but inside, Wolfe had restored his symmetry. And if there was one thing I'd learned from him, it was that every sweet death leaves an aftertaste. Some just take longer to fade. Dinner that evening was quiet enough to make the clock in the hall sound like a hammer. Fritz served trout with lemon butter, a dish that normally made Wolfe hum with satisfaction, but that night he only ate what civility required. The orchids upstairs were tended, the ledgers closed, and yet there was a lingering unrest in the air, as if the brownstone itself hadn't decided whether to exhale. I cleared the table, poured Wolfe his beer, and asked, "You going to keep pretending the case is done?" He shot me a look that could have carved marble. "It is concluded, Archie. Kramer has his culprit, the courts will have their spectacle, and I have my disgust. That's not the same thing as peace." "Pfui," he said, but the sound lacked venom. "Peace is not a condition of intellect. It is the byproduct of ignorance." That was Wolfe for your right, but I refused to admit it. I stayed quiet, because I knew him well enough to recognize when silence did more damage than argument. He leaned back, eyes half closed, swirling the beer in his glass like it might yield a better world if he just found the right angle. "Archie," he said after a long pause, "have you ever observed how men justify cruelty when they believe they are serving order?" "Sure," I said. "They call it business, government, or love, depending on who's holding the knife." He gave a soft grunt. Miss Rayner believed she was preserving purity. She imagined herself immune to the corruption she denounced. It is a delusion I find intolerable because it masquerades as reason. He took another sip and stared into the dark window beyond his desk. Outside, the city moved without conscience, a rhythm of light and noise that didn't care whether justice had been served or merely simulated. I said, "You're thinking about her ledger." "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "about intention. She left those pages not as evidence, but as inheritance. She hoped I would read and comprehend her logic, that I would find her crime reasonable. And did you?" His eyes turned toward me, steady and cold. "No crime committed with deliberation and vanity can ever be reasonable. She sought to cleanse deceit by wielding it. That is the purest form of hypocrisy." "Maybe she thought she was protecting something worth saving," I said. "Sometimes people do the wrong thing for the right reason." He frowned. "That is the language of sentimentalists and politicians. The wrong thing, Archie, poisons everything it touches." I let him have the last word for a while. The room filled with the faint hiss of the radiator and the smell of cigars Fritz had left within arm's reach. Wolfe finally lit one, took a long drag, and said, "You are restless." "I like endings that stay ended," I said. This one doesn't feel finished. Park and Durrant will get prison, Rayner's facing trial, but it still feels like everyone lost something they were trying to protect. Indeed. Reputation, ambition, illusion. He blew a thin line of smoke. Each built a structure of deceit and mistook it for virtue. When such edifices fall, no one escapes the dust. He fell silent again, and for a moment I thought he'd drifted into one of his philosophical trances. Then he said, "You are fond of her." I blinked. "Rayner?" "Not exactly. She was too polished to trust. But I'll admit she had presence." "Presence," Wolfe murmured, "is often mistaken for integrity. You are not immune to appearances, Archie." "Few are." "I'll work on it," I said dryly. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. "No need. It is your imperfection that allows you to see humanity as it is. I must observe it from afar. You, unfortunately, must live among it." "Nice to know I'm the field specimen," I said. "You are indispensable," he said without opening his eyes. "My mind constructs. Your instincts confirm. Between us lies the balance neither of us could achieve alone." That was Wolfe's version of affection, and I wasn't about to ruin the moment by pointing it out. I reached for my own drink and let the quiet settle again. After a while, Fritz returned to collect the dishes, pausing only long enough to ask whether the master desired dessert. Wolfe shook his head. "No sweets," he said firmly. "I find I've acquired an aversion." When Fritz left, I grinned. "So that's it then. No dessert, no guilt, no humanity left to examine." He gave a slow sigh. "On the contrary, Archie, humanity remains inexhaustible. That is the misfortune." I finished my drink and stood. "Guess I'll call it a night, then." He nodded without looking up. "Do so. And Archie, lock the front door. The world has a tiresome habit of returning when uninvited." I did as told, turning the bolt until it clicked. The city beyond was still awake, but the brownstone had reclaimed its sanctity, its silence, its order. Wolfe would stay there in his chair, thinking until the beer was gone and the smoke turned blue. I'd climb the stairs, maybe read, maybe dream of something simpler than poisoned marzipan and moral arithmetic. But I knew, as surely as Wolfe did, that peace in this house was always temporary. Somewhere beyond those thick walls, the next disruption was already forming, sweet on the outside, deadly underneath, waiting for the man who never left his chair to take notice once again. The next morning brought fog so thick you could have spread it on toast. It rolled along the street, clinging to the brownstone's windows, muting even the usual city racket. Wolfe hated fog. He said it made the air too democratic, everyone's breath blending with everyone else's. I found it kind of fitting. The city was mourning in its own way, hiding its face after a scandal it had helped build. I was on my second cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. Fritz answered, then came back with an expression that could only mean trouble, or at least inconvenience. "A gentleman to see Mr. Wolfe," he said. "He says it is urgent." "Name?" I asked. He gave one, Fritz said delicately. "Mr. Saul Liddell." That name cracked open the quiet. I went to the office. Wolfe was already seated, his book set aside, his brow creased like an unrolled map. "Show him in," he said. Liddell looked worse than a man who'd just been in the papers for the wrong reasons. His suit was still expensive but wrinkled. His eyes had the hollow gleam of someone who'd been reading headlines about his own failure. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, nodding stiffly. "Goodwin." Wolfe didn't offer a seat right away. "You've chosen an inconvenient hour," he said. "But since you have come unannounced, I presume necessity outweighs courtesy." Liddell sat without waiting for permission. That didn't help his case. "I came because I think you've made a mistake." "I rarely do," Wolfe said. "She's innocent," Liddell said, leaning forward. "Judith Rayner. I know what she did looks damning, but she wasn't capable of it." Not the way you think. I glanced at Wolfe, who remained motionless. You're aware she confessed to orchestrating the fraud and manipulating her subordinates into concealing it? Liddell waved that off. Confession under pressure. She was covering for someone. Who? Wolfe asked. He hesitated. Frayne, the dead man. That got Wolfe's eyebrows to lift a fraction. A novel defense, he said. Do go on. Frayne wasn't investigating the irregularities. He created them. Judith discovered it too late. She confronted him, threatened to expose him, and the next day, he was dead. I think he planned to frame her. He sent those marzipans himself. He always had a flair for the theatrical. I studied him. He believed it, or wanted to. Why come to us? I asked. We're not your lawyers. Because you're the only one who might see the truth, Liddell said. You expose the surface, but not the depth. Wolfe's expression didn't shift, but I could tell his mind was already tracing the logic. He didn't like interruptions, but he liked inconsistencies even less. Mr. Liddell, he said, you are attempting to resuscitate a corpse by drowning it again. Frayne is dead. His guilt or innocence cannot alter the fact that Miss Rayner manipulated the living. However, he paused, the room tightening around the word. However, if your statement contains a single verifiable element, it warrants examination. What do you possess to support it? Liddell reached into his coat and withdrew a thin envelope. Copies of correspondence between Frayne and a bank in Zurich. Coded but suggestive. Transfers under false charities. If Judith found these, she might have thought he was stealing. Maybe he was. I took the papers and handed them to Wolfe, who scanned the first page. His lips compressed. This is indeed Frayne's hand, he murmured. The man was meticulous, even in deception. He closed the folder. Archie, call Inspector Kramer. Tell him to retrieve the originals from the Foundation vault, if they exist. I wish to verify the pattern. When I returned from the call, Liddell was standing, hat in hand. If I'm wrong, I'll disappear quietly, he said. But if I'm right, then you've condemned the wrong person. Wolfe regarded him for a long, heavy moment. If you are right, sir, then Miss Rayner's morality ascends from delusion to tragedy, and that is a far more grievous offense. After Liddell left, Wolfe sat perfectly still, eyes unfocused, fingers tapping once against the armrest. I'd seen that look before, the one that meant the ground under the case had just shifted. Archie, he said quietly, prepare to visit the Foundation once more. If Frayne engineered both the theft and the poison, he intended a posthumous cleansing of his own guilt. The question is, who assisted him? You think someone else helped? Every deceiver needs a confessor, he said, and Miss Rayner, for all her intellect, was far too proud to play accomplice. No, someone else delivered those boxes. Another layer, I asked. He gave a curt nod. Murder seldom ends where it begins. It ripples. He closed his eyes. We have concluded nothing. We merely mistook a pause for a period. I exhaled. So we're back in it. Indeed, Wolfe said. And this time, Archie, I suggest you bring your raincoat. The weather and the truth appear inclined to drizzle. The day that followed felt slower than molasses running uphill, though beneath the calm something taut was coiling. Wolfe barely moved from his chair, his eyes locked not on the orchids or a book, but on the envelope Liddell had brought. The morning fog had thinned, but not his concentration. Every so often he'd make a small sound, a grunt, a hum, a quiet exhalation that meant he was threading logic through a needle too narrow for anyone else's hands. By noon, Saul Panzer had called in from his end of the investigation. Archie, he said, his voice even as always, I checked with the Zurich bank. Those coded transactions are real, but the account doesn't belong to Frayne or Rayner. It's under a shell company. Name of record, WL Consulting. WL, I repeated. Mean anything to you? Maybe not, Saul said. But guess who set it up 2 years ago? Saul Liddell. I froze. You're sure? As sure as a Swiss banker can be on the record, he said. He's been skimming money from the foundation through foreign transfers. If Frayne found out, that makes motive. If Rayner found out too, that makes chaos. I thanked him and hung up, already hearing Wolfe's measured tone in my head before I even reached the office. He didn't look up when I entered. He just said, "You have news." Better than news. Proof. Liddell's playing a deeper game than we thought. The Zurich account's his. Saul traced it. Wolfe's eyes opened at last. "Ah," he said softly. "Then we have located the composer behind the orchestra." He leaned forward, fingertips pressed together. "Consider the sequence, Archie. Frayne discovers Liddell's embezzlement. Rayner learns of irregularities but misinterprets them, assuming Frayne is guilty. Meanwhile, Liddell, fearing exposure, arranges Frayne's death, artfully disguised through poison meant to implicate Rayner and Park. When suspicion blooms, he appeals to me, the supposed neutral mind, to redirect judgment. It is perfect symmetry, a circle of guilt closing upon itself. "Except he got greedy," I said. "Coming back here tipped his hand." "Yes," Wolfe said. "Guilt, like gluttony, cannot resist one final indulgence. Liddell returned not to save Rayner, but to ensure her silence would endure. But he miscalculated." He pushed the envelope toward me. "You will call Inspector Kramer, tell him to recall Miss Rayner from custody immediately and hold Liddell for questioning. I will not see an innocent woman, deluded though she is, serve as scapegoat for a man of polished depravity." I called Kramer. The inspector was in no mood for philosophy. "You're saying Liddell set it all up?" "I've got him on record trying to clear Rayner." "Exactly," I said. "That's the genius of it. He cleared her because he knew she was harmless. Wolfe says the bank account proves it." Kramer grunted. "If this blows up in my face, Goodwin, I'm sending the reporters to your front steps." "Fine," I said. "We'll have beer waiting." By late afternoon, the brownstone stillness was broken by a call from Kramer himself. "Your fat friend was right," he said. "Liddell cracked after an hour, claimed Frayne was blackmailing him, so he sent him a poisoned gift, said it was just to teach him a lesson, not to kill. You ever notice they all think death is a coincidence until it's not?" I relayed that to Wolfe. He gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. Justice is rarely symmetrical, Archie. It tends to lean toward irony. At 6, the doorbell rang again. Fritz admitted Judith Rayner, escorted by a weary but visibly relieved police escort who waited outside. She looked thinner, her poise softened at the edges. When she saw Wolfe, she hesitated, then said, "I was told I could thank you." "You may," Wolfe said. "Though gratitude is often misplaced. I merely corrected a misalignment of facts." "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Liddell. He came to me first, told me Frayne was laundering money. He even showed me documents." "Documents he forged," Wolfe said. "He needed you to believe Frayne was guilty so you would act predictably, so that suspicion would bloom along the path he paved." Her hands trembled slightly. "And I did exactly as he hoped." Wolfe inclined his head. "You did. But your intentions, though misguided, were not criminal." She sank into the chair opposite him. "I believed in the foundation," she said. "I wanted to save it. Instead, I became its ruin." "Miss Rayner," Wolfe said, his tone softer than I'd heard it in days. "Foundations are built of men and women, not marble or charters. The edifice was corrupt long before you noticed the cracks. You merely mistook collapse for betrayal." She met his gaze, something like a sad smile flickering. "That sounds like forgiveness." "It is not," Wolfe said. "It is observation. Forgiveness is for priests." After she left, Fritz brought dinner, veal cutlets with herbs and a bottle of Pinot Noir. Wolfe ate slowly, methodically, like a man rebuilding equilibrium one bite at a time. When the plates were cleared, he said, "It is curious, Archie, how evil so often wears the face of competence. Liddell was efficient, educated, deliberate, yet he lacked imagination enough to foresee that precision leaves its own fingerprints." "Maybe that's what trips people up," I said. "They think being clever makes them invisible." He nodded once. "Yes, cleverness without conscience is its own confession." The clock chimed 9. Outside, the fog had lifted, leaving the city sharp again, every streetlight cutting through clean air. Wolfe poured his final beer, the sound crisp against the quiet. "Another case closed," I said. And all it took was a few poisoned sweets, a handful of liars, and one overfed philosopher with a taste for symmetry. Wolfe's eyes half closed, amusement flickering there. "Archie," he said, "you persist in describing intellect as indulgence. It is not gluttony. It is necessity." "Sure," I said, "but you enjoy it too much for it to be virtue." He allowed the faintest curve of a smile. "Perhaps. Yet without appetite, reason starves, and you, my dear fellow, would find that intolerably dull." He lifted his glass in quiet salute, then leaned back, letting the house sink once more into its habitual calm. Outside, the city moved on, ignorant as ever, while within the brownstone, the air settled again into that rare equilibrium only Nero Wolfe could impose, a silence dense with thought, the faint scent of orchids upstairs, and the unspoken promise that the next disturbance would come soon enough. The city had the good sense to quiet down by the time the case truly ended. Outside, a soft drizzle polished the sidewalks to mirror brightness, and the brownstone was once again the calmest place in New York. The orchids upstairs were back to being the only living things Wolfe trusted, and Fritz had returned to his culinary hymns in the kitchen. But for all the order restored, the office still carried the faint scent of deception, something sweet that lingered long after the source had been scraped away. Wolfe sat behind his desk, immovable as ever, his bulk wrapped in the stillness of a mind that had already decided how the world should fit together again. I was across from him, notebook open, though I didn't need to take any more notes. The story was finished. Wolfe just hadn't said it yet. He always waited for the echo before calling it silence. "I received a note from Inspector Kramer," he said finally, a masterpiece of irritation. "He informs me that Liddell has signed a full confession, accompanied by the predictable protestations of remorse." "Remorse, huh?" I said. "That's rich. A man like Liddell feels sorry the way a snake feels sorry for shedding skin." "Quite," Wolfe murmured. "He repents the exposure, not the act. The distinction is vital." He poured his beer with the same precision he used to dismantle lies. In the end, all the actors performed to their nature. Frayn's arrogance, Rayner's misguided zeal, Park's fear, Durrant's complicity, Liddell's vanity. Each sought to cleanse or conceal, and each succeeded only in confirming my general theory of humanity. "Which is?" I asked. "That it is incurably fond of justification." I grinned. "You make it sound terminal." "It is," he said. "Man commits sin with the confidence of one improving the world. It is why law exists, and why it must be interpreted by the sane." He took a slow sip, eyes half-lidded. "Kramer, of course, will claim the glory. Let him. He thrives on the illusion of victory." I leaned back. "You're not exactly running short on those yourself." He ignored that, which meant agreement. "Miss Rayner, incidentally, will face no charge. Kramer was almost magnanimous about it. She will, however, withdraw from the foundation and devote herself to private reflection, a pious phrase for exile." "She'll manage," I said. "Some people like their guilt dressed up as purpose. Gives them something to polish." He allowed himself the faintest flicker of amusement. "Archie, you grow cynical in my shadow." "Just reflective," I said. "You're the mirror." That earned a small grunt of approval. Wolfe leaned back, hands folded over his stomach, the picture of containment. "There is one thing," he said. "You recall the first marzipan box, the one Miss Rayner delivered, the box that introduced this entire grotesque confection?" I nodded. "Hard to forget. I've still got dreams about it." "It arrived," he said, "with no sender's mark and yet within a ribbon imported exclusively through one Manhattan supplier, Maison de Fleur's own wrapping service. I examined the remaining paper this morning. There was an imperceptible indentation beneath the fold. 2 letters, pressed by a sealing tool, not RF, as we saw before, but SL. "Liddell," I said. "Of course," Wolfe said. His vanity left a signature even where anonymity was essential. He wished me to see his craft and not recognize it. "Pride, Archie. Pride is the only consistent handwriting in human deceit." That was the last nail. Everything fit neatly again. The poison, the framing, the false confession, the tidy trail of greed dressed as reform. The sweet death had turned out to be nothing more than one man's attempt to season corruption with art. Wolfe finished his beer and set the glass down gently. "It is a peculiar satisfaction," he said, "to see intellect employed so completely in service of folly. It affirms the necessity of detachment. Were I inclined to moralize, I would call it a cautionary tale against the temptation to sweeten vice." I stood, stretching the stiffness out of my legs. "You moralize just fine without trying. The rest of us just call it cynicism." He closed his eyes, half smiling. "Cynicism, my dear Archie, is merely observation without appetite. I at least retain mine." That was his way of saying the world hadn't disappointed him enough to skip dinner. Fritz's timing was as impeccable as ever. He appeared in the doorway just then, announcing that the duck was ready. Wolfe rose as ceremoniously as a king leaving an audience and started toward the dining room. As he passed me, he said, "Archie, if anyone sends dessert tonight, refuse it." "On moral grounds or dietary?" I asked. "On aesthetic ones," he said, and disappeared into the hall. I watched him go, the great detective lumbering off to conquer another meal with the same intensity he'd just dismantled a man's life. Outside, the rain softened into mist again, erasing footprints on the sidewalk. Inside, the brownstone returned to its usual rhythm, the hum of Fritz's plates, the creak of floorboards, the faint clink of glass. And I thought then, as I often did, that for all the darkness this city poured through our door, Wolfe always found a way to leave the world slightly more orderly than he'd found it. It wasn't peace, not exactly, but it was his kind of justice. I closed my notebook, switched off the lamp, and followed him to dinner, 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 and followed him to dinner.